Gigabyte Z690 AORUS Pro, priced at $329.99. It's one of the less expensive offerings in the Z690 universe. There are a whopping 13 total USB ports, 2.5B and integrated Wi-Fi 6 for fast networking, 4 M2 sockets, a premium Realtek audio codec, overbuilt VRMs, and an updated appearance. The new look may be polarizing, with its gray on black heatsinks, but overall we like what the AORUS Pro delivers as a package very much. Since this is our first Gigabyte Z690 review, we'll briefly cover the product stack. On the design front, the Z690 AORUS Pro changed things up, going with less coverage on the shrouds and heatsinks due to PSI slot placement. The M2, chipset and top VRM heatsink are all gray, providing a rather stark contrast against the black PCB and other heatsinks. Personally, I prefer the old style that covers more of the board and uses gray more sparingly. That said, this is still a good-looking board and makes a great focal point for your Z690 build, though the lack of RGB lighting elements may be a turnoff for some. Looks aside, the Z690 AORUS Pro performed well, mixing in with the other two Z690 DDR5 boards we've tested so far. The board led a few benchmarks, including Handbrake, Cinebench R23, POV-Ray, and did a clean sweep in the Procyon office tests and photo editing. RAM bandwidth and latency were spot on with the other results, and so were our gaming tests. Power use was also in the middle of the Z690 boards tested so far. Overall, the Z690 AORUS Pro is a complete package that isn't too hard on your wallet. Read on for additional information on features, overclocking, and takeaways from our time with the board. Before we do that, here's a complete list of the Z690 AORUS Pro specifications, direct from Gigabyte. Inside the AORUS Pro's box are several accessories, including SATA cables, a Wi-Fi antenna, and screws. We didn't find a disk USB stick with drivers, but that could be a review sample omission. Worst case scenario, you'd have to download the drivers from the website, but that's a good idea anyway, to make sure you have the most up-to-date software. Taking a closer look at the AORUS Pro, we see a matte black PCB, along with some gray lines stenciled on the board, matching the heatsinks and shrouds. The VRM heatsink sports the AORUS branding, while the chipset has an AORUS eagle on with a mirror finish. The black and gray board uses reinforcement on the primary PSI slot and all 4 DRAM slots to mitigate EMI, and an extra support for heavy graphics cards. As we focus on the top half of the board, we'll cover the VRM heatsinks and all of the headers and buttons in the area. The largest feature in this area, the VRM heatsink, consists of 2 separate chunks of aluminum, with the left VRM bank reaching out over the I/O area for that extra bit of mass and cooling. Grooves are cut out in the heatsinks to increase surface area and improve thermal transfer. The CPU receives power from a combination of 8-pin and 4-pin EPS connectors found on the top edge above the heatsinks. Like most boards, the 8-pin is required, while the 4-pin is optional. The socket area has a bunch of capacitors around the socket, along with some stenciled writing that displays the brand and model. To the right of the socket are 4 reinforced DRAM slots capable of handling up to 128 GB of DDR5 RAM. Gigabyte lists support up to DDR5 6200 OC, but your mileage may vary depending on the type of kit used. This is one of the lower speeds listed of the boards we've seen so far, but still has plenty of headroom over the base spec of DDR5 4800. Gigabyte didn't have the information in the manual to share the maximum speeds for more sticks and/or ranks, but it is less than the DDR5 6200 listed. The board did though run ArcSkill Trident Z52X 16GB DDR5 5600 kit without issue. Just above the DRAM slots, we run into the first set of fan and RGB headers. Starting with the fans, there's a total of 8 4-pin headers scattered around the board. Gigabyte's manual doesn't mention the default mode PWM or DC for these headers, but you can switch them through the BIOS. Each 4-pin fan pump header supports 2A24W, which should be plenty to power your cooling directly from the motherboard. To the right of the fan headers are 2 RGB headers, one 3-pin ARGB, and one 4-pin RGB header. The other 2 headers, one of each type again, sit on the bottom edge of the board. Since the motherboard doesn't provide its own RGB lighting, you'll have to use the onboard headers or a third-party solution. If they're attached to the board, the RGB Fusion software in the App Center controls them. Finally, on the right edge of the board, we run into the 2-character debug display, a 24-pin ATX connector to power the board, 2 more 4-pin fan headers, a 2-pin temperature header, a front panel USB 3.2 GEN1 header, and a front panel USB 3.2 GEN2X2 Type-C header, with more and more cases adding USB 3.2 GEN2X2 Type-C ports. Having a full-speed header on the board is a welcome sight. Also found in this area is the 4 LED debug feature. If there's a problem in one of these areas during the post-process, the LED where the problem occurred stays lit. As we move to the bottom half of the board, we see a mostly exposed audio section, PCIe slots, and hidden below the heatsinks and shrouds 4 M2 sockets. This isn't the flagship chip, but is the latest generation codec, and most users will be satisfied with what it has to offer. In the middle of the board, we'll start with the PCIe slots. The primary full-length slot runs at PCIe 5.0 x 16 speeds and uses Gigabyte's ultra-durable SMD PCIe 5.0 armor for additional support and EMI protection. The bottom 2 full-length slots are connected through the chipset and run up to PCIe 3.0 x 4 speeds. Sitting around the PCIe slots are 4 M2 sockets. Above the primary PCIe slot, the top socket supports PCIe 4.0 x 4 drives up to 110mm. The second slot down, M2 CSP, connects via the chipset and runs both SATA and PCIe 4.0 x 4 modules up to 110mm. Lastly, the bottom 2 sockets connect via the chipset and support up to 110mm drives and PCIe 4.0 x 4 speeds. I'd like to see Gigabyte implement the new screwless M2 latches here, as we've seen on some ASUS and MSI boards. Moving to the right edge on the bottom half of the board, we run into a pair of Thunderbolt headers for use with a Gigabyte add-in card. If you're looking to RAID your SATA or M2 drives, they both support RAID 0, 1, 5, 10 modes. Since the new chipset has more bandwidth and lane flexibility, sharing between SATA ports and PCIe slots isn't necessary with this configuration. Last but not least, just below the SATA ports is a white button used to reset the system.